El Rodeo Prison, located outside Caracas, is not just a correctional facility. It is a symbol of Venezuela's broken justice system. Built to detain and rehabilitate, El Rodeo instead became a battlefield where the authority of the state collapsed and inmate power took control. For years, this prison reflected the wider crisis gripping the nation. Overcrowding, corruption, violence, and neglect. El Rodeo Prison is located in Miranda State, just outside Venezuela's capital city, Caracas. Its proximity to the political and economic heart of the country gave it strategic importance within the national prison system. Unlike remote detention centers hidden far from public view, El Rodeo stood close to government institutions, urban neighborhoods, and major highways. This location made its condition impossible to ignore, especially when violence escalated and the consequences spilled beyond its walls. Originally constructed to function as a standard correctional facility, El Rodeo was intended to house inmates under state supervision while maintaining order, discipline, and rehabilitation programs. On paper, it represented the government's promise of justice and control. In reality, the prison's infrastructure was outdated almost from the moment it opened, unable to adapt to the rapidly growing prison population driven by crime, political instability, and delayed judicial processes. El Rodeo was not a single structure, but a complex that included multiple prison units, most notably El Rodeo I and El Rodeo II. Each section operated almost like a separate territory, with its own internal power structures. This physical division made oversight difficult and allowed inmate groups to establish dominance over specific areas, slowly eroding centralized authority within the complex. Because of its location near Caracas, El Rodeo became a holding facility for inmates involved in serious crimes, including armed robbery, kidnapping, and gang-related violence. Many detainees were awaiting trial, sometimes for years, due to Venezuela's overwhelmed court system. This mix of convicted criminals and pre-trial detainees intensified tension inside the prison and blurred the line between punishment and indefinite detention. The prison's significance grew as reports emerged that criminal operations were being coordinated from inside its walls. El Rodeo was no longer just a place where criminals were confined. It became a command center for illegal activities extending into the outside world. Phone networks, bribed guards, and corrupt officials allowed inmates to maintain influence far beyond the prison gates. As conditions worsened, El Rodeo began to attract national and international attention. Human rights organizations cited it as an example of institutional neglect and state failure. Media coverage increasingly portrayed the prison as a mirror of Venezuela's broader social collapse, where shortages, corruption, and violence were no longer exceptions but the norm. Families of inmates frequently gathered outside the prison, forming makeshift camps during crises. Their presence transformed El Rodeo into a public stage of suffering and desperation. Mothers, wives, and children waited for news, food deliveries, or permission to see their loved ones, highlighting how the prison's problems affected not only inmates but entire communities. Over time, El Rodeo's name became synonymous with fear, chaos, and lost control. It stood as a geographic and symbolic landmark within Venezuela's penal system, close enough to the capital to reflect state authority, yet distant enough to expose its absence. The prison's location amplified its impact, ensuring that when El Rodeo descended into violence, the shockwaves were felt across the nation. Severe overcrowding was one of the most destructive forces shaping life inside El Rodeo Prison. The facility was built to hold a controlled number of inmates, but over time that limit was ignored as arrests increased and court cases stalled. Cells designed for a handful of prisoners were forced to accommodate dozens, leaving no space to sleep, move, or even breathe comfortably. Overcrowding was not a temporary problem. It became the prison's permanent condition. Many inmates were pre-trial detainees who had not yet been convicted of any crime. Delays in Venezuela's judicial system meant that prisoners waited months or even years for hearings. As new detainees arrived daily, very few were released, creating a constant buildup of bodies within the same confined spaces. This imbalance turned El Rodeo into a holding warehouse rather than a functioning correctional institution. The physical infrastructure of the prison could not support such numbers. Toilets overflowed, ventilation systems failed, and access to clean water became limited. Inmates were forced to sleep on floors, in hallways, or suspended in makeshift hammocks. Hygiene deteriorated rapidly, allowing disease and infections to spread unchecked throughout the prison population. Food distribution became another point of crisis under overcrowded conditions. Official rations were insufficient for the number of inmates present, forcing prisoners to rely on food brought by families or purchased through illegal internal markets. Those without outside support often went hungry, reinforcing inequality and dependence within the inmate hierarchy. Medical care was virtually non-existent for the overcrowded population. A small number of medical staff, if present at all, could not treat thousands of inmates suffering from injuries, chronic illnesses, or infectious diseases. Minor wounds often became life-threatening, and untreated mental health issues contributed to escalating aggression and instability. Overcrowding also intensified violence. With limited space and resources, disputes over territory, food, or status frequently turned deadly. Confined conditions increased stress, paranoia, and desperation, creating an environment where conflict was inevitable. Guards, already outnumbered, retreated further from direct control, allowing inmate-enforced order to replace institutional authority. As official supervision weakened, overcrowding strengthened the power of prison gangs. Control over space became currency, with stronger groups claiming larger or safer areas. New arrivals were often forced to pay for protection or space, turning human overcrowding into a profitable system for dominant inmates. The overcrowded reality of El Rodeo was not accidental. It was the result of systemic neglect and institutional collapse. Each additional inmate strained an already broken structure, pushing the prison closer to chaos. Over time, overcrowding transformed El Rodeo into a pressure cooker, where human density, neglect, and despair combined to create an explosive environment. The loss of state control inside El Rodeo Prison did not happen overnight. It was a gradual collapse shaped by neglect, corruption, and fear. Prison authorities were officially responsible for maintaining order, yet their presence inside the facility became increasingly symbolic rather than functional. Guards remained stationed at perimeter checkpoints, while the interior of the prison slipped beyond their reach. Severely outnumbered and under-equipped, correctional officers faced an impossible task. In many sections of El Rodeo, guards refused to enter cell blocks without military support. This withdrawal created power vacuums that were quickly filled by organized inmate groups. The state still owned the prison on paper, but operational control belonged to those inside. Corruption further weakened authority. Weapons, drugs, mobile phones, and luxury items entered the prison through bribed officials and compromised supply chains. Rather than enforcing rules, some guards became participants in the illegal economy, exchanging access and silence for money or protection. This erosion of integrity dismantled any remaining respect for institutional power. As state influence declined, formal rules were replaced by informal inmate laws. Disciplinary systems emerged that were enforced through violence rather than due process. Punishments were swift and brutal, often carried out in public to maintain fear and obedience. Justice inside El Rodeo no longer followed legal codes. It followed the will of those who held weapons. The absence of authority allowed inmates to organize daily life independently. They controlled sleeping arrangements, food distribution, visiting schedules, and internal commerce. Entire sections of the prison operated like autonomous zones, complete with their own leadership structures and financial systems, making external intervention increasingly difficult. Government attempts to reassert control were inconsistent and reactive. Rather than addressing structural failures, authorities relied on temporary lockdowns or negotiated truces with inmate leaders. These short-term solutions only legitimized the power of prison gangs and reinforced the perception that the state had surrendered control. The loss of control also had deadly consequences during moments of unrest. When violence erupted, the lack of authority meant conflicts escalated rapidly without mediation. Fires, explosions, and armed confrontations became common, leaving little room for de-escalation or protection of human life. By the time the crisis reached national attention, El Rodeo was no longer a prison governed by the state. It was a closed territory ruled by inmate power. The government's authority stopped at the walls, revealing a justice system unable to enforce its own laws within the spaces designed to uphold them. Inside El Rodeo Prison, true power rested with the pranes, powerful inmate leaders who ruled through fear, money, and weapons. These figures were not unofficial troublemakers, but recognized authorities within the prison walls. Their influence shaped every aspect of daily life, from security and discipline to commerce and survival. In the absence of state control, the pranes became the ultimate decision-makers. A pran typically rose to power through violence, reputation, and strategic alliances. Many were experienced criminals with strong connections to gangs outside the prison. Once established, they surrounded themselves with armed followers who acted as enforcers. This structure mirrored organized crime syndicates, with clear chains of command and strict obedience. Weapons were central to a pran's authority. Firearms, grenades, and knives circulated openly inside El Rodeo, often displayed as symbols of dominance. Control of these weapons allowed prans to suppress rival groups and intimidate the general prison population. Their firepower ensured that resistance was rare and usually fatal. The prans also controlled the prison economy. They imposed mandatory taxes on inmates for protection, food distribution, sleeping space, and even access to bathrooms. Families visiting prisoners were often forced to pay fees to deliver supplies. This system transformed survival into a financial transaction and generated enormous profits for prison leaders. Discipline under pran rule was swift and merciless. Accused inmates were subjected to beatings, torture, or execution without trial. Public punishments served as warnings, reinforcing fear and submission. In this system, justice was not about fairness, it was about control. Despite their brutality, prans maintained a form of order that the state could not. Violence between ordinary inmates was often regulated, not eliminated, to prevent chaos that could threaten leadership. This created a disturbing stability, where fear replaced law, and obedience replaced rights. The power of the prans extended beyond prison walls. From inside El Rodeo, they coordinated kidnappings, extortion, drug trafficking, and assassinations across Venezuela. Mobile phones and outside networks allowed them to operate criminal enterprises as if they were free, further blurring the line between imprisonment and control. The rule of the prans turned El Rodeo into a criminal kingdom sealed behind concrete walls. Their dominance exposed a painful truth. When the state abandons its authority, power does not disappear. It reorganizes itself in the hands of the most violent and organized. Extreme violence was not an occasional outbreak inside El Rodeo Prison. It was a constant condition of daily life. From the moment inmates entered the facility, they were forced to adapt to an environment where brutality was normalized. Violence was used as a language of power, a method of control, and a tool for survival in a system where law no longer existed. Firearms inside El Rodeo were not hidden. They were openly displayed. Assault rifles, pistols, grenades, and homemade explosives circulated freely within the prison. These weapons transformed ordinary conflicts into lethal encounters. Arguments over space, money, or loyalty could escalate into shootouts, leaving bodies behind with little consequence. Public executions became a method of enforcement under inmate rule. Those accused of betrayal, theft, or disobedience were often punished in front of others. These acts were deliberately visible, designed to instill fear and discourage resistance. Death was not just a punishment, it was a warning. Violence was also psychological. Inmates lived under constant threat, never knowing when a raid, punishment, or attack might occur. Sleep was fragmented by gunfire, screams, and explosions echoing through cell blocks. This continuous stress eroded mental health, pushing many prisoners into paranoia, aggression, or emotional collapse. During large-scale confrontations, violence reached levels comparable to urban warfare. Barricades were constructed inside prison corridors, and armed groups defended territories like military units. Explosions tore through concrete walls, filling the air with smoke and debris. In these moments, El Rodeo resembled a battlefield more than a detention center. Guards and authorities were often powerless during violent outbreaks. Outnumbered and outgunned, they retreated to secure perimeters while chaos unfolded inside. Emergency responses were delayed or non-existent, allowing conflicts to burn themselves out at the cost of human lives. Medical response during violent incidents was nearly impossible. Wounded inmates were frequently left untreated, bleeding for hours or days. Many died not from the initial injuries, but from infection or blood loss. The absence of emergency care turned survivable wounds into death sentences. Extreme violence at El Rodeo did not remain confined within its walls. News of massacres, explosions, and armed uprisings spread fear throughout Venezuelan society. Each violent episode reinforced the prison's reputation as a place where human life held little value and brutality had become routine. In June 2011, the crisis inside El Rodeo Prison reached a breaking point that shocked Venezuela and drew international attention. A violent uprising erupted after authorities attempted to regain control from armed inmate groups. What followed was not a short disturbance, but a prolonged and deadly siege that exposed the full collapse of the prison system. The confrontation began when security forces tried to enter parts of the prison that had long been controlled by inmates. Almost immediately, they were met with heavy gunfire and explosions from inside the compound. Inmates, heavily armed and organized, resisted with military-style tactics, forcing authorities to retreat and secure the outer perimeter. As the siege intensified, explosions echoed across the surrounding area. Thick smoke rose above the prison walls, visible from nearby highways and neighborhoods. Families of inmates rushed to the prison gates, desperate for information, while gunfire continued inside. The scene resembled an urban war zone rather than a correctional facility. The government deployed thousands of soldiers, National Guard units, and armored vehicles to contain the situation. Helicopters circled overhead, and elite tactical teams prepared for forced entry. Despite this overwhelming show of force, authorities struggled to regain control, revealing just how entrenched inmate power had become. Inside the prison, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Food, water, and medical supplies ran low as the standoff dragged on. Inmates were trapped between rival factions and advancing security forces. The wounded lay untreated, and the dead remained where they fell, further escalating fear and desperation. Negotiations became a central strategy as direct assaults proved costly. Government officials attempted to convince inmate leaders to surrender weapons and release hostages. These talks highlighted a disturbing reality. The state was forced to negotiate with prisoners it was supposed to control. After weeks of tension, security forces gradually regained access to parts of the prison. Weapons caches were seized, and surviving inmates were transferred to other facilities. The operation officially ended with the government declaring control restored, though the true human cost remained unclear. The 2011 siege of El Rodeo Prison marked one of the bloodiest episodes in Venezuela's prison history. It exposed the depth of institutional failure and showed the world what happens when prisons become armed strongholds instead of centers of justice and rehabilitation. El Rodeo Prison ultimately became more than a detention center. It evolved into a powerful symbol of Venezuela's systemic failure. Its collapse reflected problems that extended far beyond prison walls, deep-rooted issues within the justice system, governance, and social structure. What happened inside El Rodeo was not an isolated disaster, but a concentrated expression of national breakdown. At the core of this failure was a justice system overwhelmed by delays, corruption, and political interference. Thousands of inmates remained incarcerated without trial, creating overcrowding that fueled instability. Courts failed to process cases efficiently, turning imprisonment into indefinite detention and stripping the concept of justice of its meaning. Government institutions responsible for oversight and reform repeatedly ignored warning signs. Reports of weapons, gang control, and extreme violence surfaced long before the 2011 siege, yet meaningful intervention never came. Instead of addressing structural issues, authorities relied on short-term containment, allowing conditions to worsen year after year. Corruption played a central role in sustaining the crisis. From guards accepting bribes to officials turning a blind eye, the system enabled criminal power to flourish. This corruption did not simply weaken authority, it actively transferred power from the state to violent inmates who filled the vacuum. El Rodeo also exposed the failure of rehabilitation as a core principle of incarceration. Education programs, psychological support, and reintegration efforts were virtually non-existent. Instead of preparing inmates to return to society, the prison hardened them, strengthening criminal networks and normalizing violence. The impact of this failure extended to families and communities. Relatives of inmates lived in constant fear, often risking their own safety to deliver food or medicine. Communities outside the prison suffered as crimes were planned and coordinated from within its walls, blurring the boundary between inside and outside violence. International observers and human rights organizations cited El Rodeo as evidence of a humanitarian crisis. Images of armed inmates and military sieges damaged Venezuela's global reputation and raised serious concerns about human rights violations, state accountability, and rule of law. El Rodeo Prison stands as a warning etched into Venezuela's modern history. It represents what happens when institutions decay, responsibility is abandoned, and power shifts to the most violent actors, turning a prison into a mirror of a nation in crisis. El Rodeo Prison is no longer just a place on the map of Venezuela. It is a lesson written in concrete, blood, and silence. Behind its walls, authority collapsed, violence replaced law, and human lives were reduced to statistics. What unfolded there was not inevitable. It was the result of neglect, corruption, and years of ignored warnings. The story of El Rodeo forces a difficult question. When a state loses control of its prisons, can it truly claim control of justice itself? Prisons are meant to reflect order, accountability, and the rule of law. At El Rodeo, they reflected fear, power without restraint, and a system pushed beyond breaking point. For the inmates who lived through its chaos, the scars remain long after the gunfire faded. For their families, the memory of waiting outside those walls is one of lasting trauma. And for Venezuela, El Rodeo stands as a reminder that prisons do not exist in isolation. They mirror the strength or weakness of the society that builds them. As the gates closed and the smoke cleared, one truth remained: a prison abandoned by justice will always be claimed by violence. The legacy of El Rodeo is not just a story of incarceration, but a warning of what happens when systems fail and humanity is forgotten.